I am 50 years old, and I was born before they invented color, when the entirety of reality was actually black and white, just like you see in old TV shows at that time. My parents, that's my mother next to the car, she's the little girl there, they were born during World War II. And their parents, my grandparents, were born during the turn of the century. At that time, airplanes had not yet been invented, and where they lived in rural Arizona, there were as yet no cars and no electricity, and nobody had indoor toilets and or radios or anything like that. Okay. Now, as a boy, I remember that the Navajo and the Apache still dressed much as they did 100 years ago, and they still, many of them, still lived in wigwams and wickiups and hogans. I have ridden past whole villages of houses like this, still occupied. And we're talking about architecture dating back to the Stone Age and still in use in the 20th century. And this is getting hard to get used to. My stepdad was raised on the Osage Reservation in Oklahoma, and this is the sort of house he grew up in. During the Great Depression, my mother's mother lived in a sort of half house, half tent, rather like this one, in the Sonoran Desert. She lived for years in this type of structure, sharing one room with her father, her mother, and 4 brothers. My father's father wore a 6-shooter on his hip and worked as a cook on a wagon train, not in the 1800s, in the 1900s. His wife, my father's mother, when she was a teenager, got a job working for the Postal Service, delivering the mail, originally on horseback. She was still doing it when I came along, only by then she had traded up to a 1957 Mercury Montclair Turnpike Cruiser, which she still had until she was 90 years old.
They don't make cars like that these days.
And incidentally, she was 90 years old in 1990. Now, these were people I knew. They had come from the horse and buggy days of the Wild Wild West. No phone, no light, no motor car, not a single luxury. And they saw that world transformed firsthand into the jet-setting space age of traffic jams and commercial interruptions just in their lifetime. And I shared a small part of that myself. I watched the lunar landing live as a little boy. And I remember that being a little boy in that exciting time, all these new discoveries and new technological advances filled me with hopeful wonder, to the point that I thought then that by now I would not even be an American citizen anymore. I fully expected to be living in a Martian colony. And okay, so we've never set foot on Mars, and we still don't have flying cars or ray guns or warp drive. But Kirk would be embarrassed to show me his communicator if he knew just a few of the things my android could do. The older generation of my family, the people I just told you about, did not share my passion for the future. They weren't going to be part of it, and they wanted no part in it, and they didn't see much promise to it either. When I was a very little boy in the 1960s, my mother's father told me that they had already invented everything that would ever be invented. And this reminds me of my favorite quote from Charles Darwin. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. It is those who know little, not those who know much, who so positively assert that this or that problem will never be solved by science. And isn't it interesting that Darwin knew this 150 years before Dunning-Kruger? Sadly, this is an accurate description of some of the elders in my family. My mother's mother, for example, actually believed that the Earth was the biggest thing in the universe. I think the words universe and galaxy to her meant the same thing. In her perspective, the sun and the moon and the other planets were all about the same size, and they all went around the Earth at different distances. She didn't realize that the stars were other suns at great distance. She thought they were smaller, low-wattage things that occasionally fell out of the sky as meteorites. I had to coax this information out of her, and I had to do it gently and tactfully, because people in my family didn't care about science at all and refused to discuss it because it didn't matter to them. Most of them were openly proud to be simple folk who were pretty much all about hunting, fishing, and football. And this is what they like to talk about over cans of cheap, watery American Pilsner. They were practical people, always up before dawn, even on their days off. They were welders, blacksmiths, carpenters, mechanics, and occasionally engineers. And in those fields, they were probably more capable than anyone in this room. But they usually wouldn't engage in conversations of any deeper or loftier merit. And they were bored or irritated by everything I found interesting. Consequently, I probably saw them in a bit of a negative light, too.
Forgot the you.
They never spoke of history beyond their own immediate ancestry. They didn't care about global affairs, except, again, where that might concern them. And otherwise, they didn't want to know anything about countries where they look different, dress funny, do weird things, and don't even speak good English. The less my elders knew about other cultures, the better, and they've actually told me so. Shortly before he died, my dad told me that he generally avoided ethnic foods except Mexican. That he never once tried to use chopsticks, and he couldn't give a shit less about anything foreign. In fact, he said to me, "This is the best damn country there is, and I don't need to know about nowhere else." Very few people questioned my dad about pretty much anything. And this shows how we were philosophically opposed. And I'm sorry to say, there were a lot of people in the older generations of both sides of my family and in the broader demographic at large who were extremely racist, sexist, nationalist, and otherwise generally judgmental. They were insular and set in their ways. And if it didn't relate to their demographic, they weren't interested in it, and that's why they would never watch a movie like... I mention this film only because it, too, illustrates how in one lifetime, all these time-honored ancestral traditions were in rapid succession challenged and rendered moot. And this is what my family, the previous generation to me, experienced in a very real way. Now, as progress is the culprit here for all these traditions going away, and progress is increasingly criticized. I listened to people I knew disdain progress as if it was something bad. The same way they would criticize skeptics or critics as if we were missing out on something. And I never understood how anyone could be against progress. Nor can I understand how so many of my countrymen were so against higher learning. I've always thought that knowledge was power, but I was told to believe that ignorance is bliss. So the list of things that we should not talk about was a lot longer than the list of things we could talk about, and this included religion. Although everyone in my family, and of course this is just representative of my family because I don't know, I thought it was disrespectful to show pictures of my family in most instances. But these are people that remind me of them. Even though all these people were Christian, and every one of them, so far as I know, was creationist, they would never crack open a Bible. And if they did, they'd put it down again pretty quickly. They could read, but they only read for practical purposes, never for entertainment nor for education either. As a matter of fact, they criticized people with a college education as only having book learning, but no common sense. And whether you have common sense or not depends on whether your opinion differs from theirs. For example, my beloved father once said to me, "I don't care what religion you are, you got enough sense to wipe your own ass, you can't be no atheist." I loved and respected my father, like a lot of other people did too, but we didn't agree on much. So I wasn't raised in a very progressive environment. In fact, my family was largely regressive, pining for some romanticized mystery period called the good old days. And this enigmatic era appears to be back when women could only wear dresses, and where they had to stay at home and be dependent housekeepers, a time when all men had short haircuts, and only white, straight Christian men had rights. It was a time when life was hard, short, and uncomfortable, and when dames, queers, heretics, and colored folk had to worry about attracting too much attention. It seems to me that was also a time just before everything started getting cool, fun, and better than ever for everyone. Remember, we're talking about people who were always opposed to progress, who hated diversity, and who would not tolerate anything labeled as alternative. They were much happier when there was only one style of anything for everyone to opt for, and when it came to music, there was only one choice, and of course that's country western. So everyone in my family seemed to side with a particular singer named Merle Haggard. Now, he seems to have made a career out of complaining about how things ain't as good as they used to be. And let me share with you a sample, and this may hurt. I wish a buck was still silver. It was back when the country was strong. Back before Elvis, before the Vietnam War came along. Before the Beatles and yesterday, when a man could still work, still would. The best of the free life behind us now. Are the good times really over for good? Are we rolling downhill like a snowball headed for hell? With no kind of chance for the flag or the Liberty Bell. I wish a Ford and a Chevy would still last 10 years like they should. Before microwave ovens, when a girl could still cook and still would. I'm not going to do this anymore. I don't know about you, but I can only interpret that last line as being a very polite way of saying, honey, get back in the kitchen and make me a sandwich. I'd like to add that I just turned over 100,000 miles in my 10-year-old Chevy and 60,000 miles in my 10-year-old motorcycle, both American-made. Everything still works on both of them, and they're both a damn sight better than anything made before 1953, which appears to be the time that Merle is pining for, back before Elvis, before they made any of the good cars yet. This song, obviously, I share, I have a deep animosity, a deep division between his world philosophy and mine. The first time I heard this song, I thought it was enormously offensive, that all this guy could do was bitch and whine, and couldn't appreciate what he had. I've always been told that people tend not to appreciate what they've got until it's gone. And I remember when I heard it as a child, I thought, well, that's stupid. Appreciate what you've got while you got it. And that's been my philosophy forever. Now, this album came out in October of 1981, when, according to Merle, a man couldn't work and wouldn't if he could. And I don't know what man he's talking about. I had 2 jobs then. I walked for miles between them, and I was lazy. That was my 19th birthday. And old Merle might have been hating life at that time. I had a great time. Women were far more interesting than they could be in his day, and street rods all looked like the Road Warrior, which was also made in that year. And the music scene, contrary to Merle, had suddenly turned hairy, scary, and mean. That same year, Ozzy Osbourne released his first solo album, Blizzard of Oz. Black Sabbath did the Mob Rules with new frontman Ronnie James Dio. Motorhead held the Ace of Spades. Iron Maiden were killers. Judas Priest were screaming for vengeance, and AC/DC was Back in Black. So there was lots better music out than Merle Haggard at that time. There weren't many atheists back then. Everyone was afraid of Satanists instead. If you played Dungeons and Dragons in 1981, you weren't a nerd. You were a witch. If you rode a custom motorcycle that wasn't a symbol of wealth, it meant you probably had a criminal history. If you had long hair, it meant you did drugs. And if you listened to the devil's music, you were of the devil. And if you were all of the above and a neo-pagan occultist, like I was at that time, well, then you're obviously satanic. To give you an idea how stupid that time period was, I was always told that if you had an earring in your right ear, if a man has an earring in his right ear, it means he's gay. If a man has an earring in his left ear, it means he's a drug dealer. I happened to know a gay drug dealer. And he didn't have either ear pierced. So since I am neither, I decided I needed to get both. Now, I've got a lot of sad tales about how kids at that time were judged and occasionally diagnosed based largely on whether they listened to heavy metal music, especially if they looked the part. And it wasn't just the fans, it was the bands. Ozzy Osbourne and Judas Priest were both brought into court at that time, charged with inciting suicides, with secretly coded messages hidden in their song lyrics. Some of you guys may remember this now. All at once, everybody's afraid to write anything because of the way some reactionary twit would misinterpret it by trying to play the record backwards. Such was the religious right at that time. But fortunately, another band called Stormtroopers of Death came out with a song that saved everybody when they said, kill yourself, don't rely on no one else, hang it up and kill yourself now! Remarkably, no one killed themselves with this record on the turntable. So all those accusations of subtly subliminal suicidal suggestions suddenly stopped. Now, Marilyn Manson comes on the scene. He tried to cash in on all that ridiculous fear of satanic rockers. But by the time he came along, we'd gotten past all that. We'd realized that makeup and a costume doesn't make you a monster. The real monsters don't look like that. And he has to cater to a largely atheist audience now. Instead of doing, outrageous and abominable things for shows, I find him sitting in front of news reporters giving eloquent interviews, because that's what we're after, right? We no longer think that sex, drugs, and rock and roll are the cause of evil. Religion is. We're not afraid of being possessed by demons. We're afraid of the priests. Now, let me illustrate what I mean. Statistically, there's a negative correlation between religiosity and what we typically think of as moral behavior. I'm sure most of you have seen the polls estimating the population of convicted felons as overwhelmingly religious, whereas the number of atheists in the prison population are always much lower than the percentage amongst free-roaming citizens. It is not possible that a significant number of these majorities were secretly atheists until they were arrested and that they only converted to Christianity after indictment, but defenders of the faith have argued that. The factions of dominant religion typically have the highest crime rate, with special emphasis on hate crimes. That will come up later. Religious people are more likely to condone the murder or torture of prisoners, where non-religious people are more likely to consider that morally wrong. But it gets worse. Another one? Okay. The most religious countries also have the highest murder rate, and the same is true of the most religious areas within the United States. The higher the religiosity of a given populace, the higher the murder rate. Secular nations show the opposite tendencies, where the less religious they are, the more peaceful they tend to be. Here in America, I always forget I'm not in America. Evangelical Christians have the highest divorce rate. They also have the highest rates of teen pregnancy. Which isn't surprising, since they think abstinence only is an appropriate way to deal with sex education. I live in Texas, where the abstinence only program has earned us the status of being the second highest rate of repeat teen pregnancies. But it gets even worse. Fundamentalist Christians have a higher rate of abortions, a testament to their hypocrisy. This is what a colossal failure the policies of the religious right have always been. But it gets even worse than that. Child Protective Services and other agencies report a significant majority of child abusers and molesters identified as very religious, and the more religious they are, the worse offenders they are. Yet, religious people still argue that the less religious we are, the less moral we are, and that the more we abandon faith, the more violent we become, with the murder rates going up all the time. But that's not what's happening. And it doesn't take much research to see that. I found this on Wikipedia in a minute. And I couldn't find a larger version of this chart, so let's look at this one, depicting violent crime. And yeah, again, we're seeing the opposite trend of what believers think it should be, and the implication is dramatically against them. Now, you'll see a spike where it's on that 70.0 line for the last time. Where is that? That's 1981. And it suddenly plummets. I don't think Merle Haggard gets any credit for that. That's when all those heavy metal albums were released along with the cartoon movie of the same name. Now, what was the best years for heavy metal? It was the first half of the 1980s. Correlating with a dramatic reduction in violent crime. Coincidence? Maybe. It could be that there were other reasons why it was, fun to be alive, or a relatively good time to be, and resulting in that. Now, for this next peak, I'm going to cite an article in the Huffington Post. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the number of nuns, that's people claiming no religious affiliation, hovered at around 5%. They had risen to only 8% by 1990, but since then, the number of people who don't consider themselves part of any religion has increased to 20%. Claude Fisher, one of the researchers at UC Berkeley, told reporters this was not happening really for decades, until around 1990, when it suddenly started to take off. Now, if you look at this last steep and dramatic drop in both the males and females, that's 1994, thereabouts. What happened then? The violent crime rate dropped to unprecedented levels, not seen since the 1970s. What happened that we never recovered the violent crime, that everything suddenly got better? If you remember, this is when most people finally installed the internet. So, this deep decline in violent crime correlates with the sudden availability of unrestricted information and an inexhaustible supply of free downloadable porn. Coincidence? Well, you got to admit that it's hard to commit violent crime when you're otherwise occupied. But I still have to argue with religious believers that over whether things are getting better because of the advances of science, or whether everything is going to hell because of our abandonment of faith. And our descent into irreverent godlessness. So let's forget all these charts and statistics and take a look back in time. Let's see if I got this in the right direction. Yeah, let's look back at the good old days and see how advertisers reflected our attitudes when men were better than women. We've always had a double standard, but it was obviously a lot worse back then. Y'all love that one? Is it always illegal? Spousal abuse, oppression, and neglect were statistically a lot worse then too, but so was our medical misunderstanding. These two ads promote the use of Lysol, a poisonous furniture cleaner, then employed for feminine hygiene. This practice resulted in hundreds of accidental deaths and several unknown intentional abortions before it was legal. And the funny thing when you read, you probably can't read this and I can't get over there to see it, but in the one on the right, it says, a man marries a woman because he loves her. So if the love grows cold, she shouldn't question him. She should question herself. Because I guess women marry men for other reasons than love. I don't know what it is. And then over here on the left, the paragraph begins, yes, she is decidedly to blame. Those good old days don't look all that good to me. Never did. Now, for a better start in life, start cola earlier. How soon is too soon? Not soon enough. Do you remember when ignorance was bliss? Do you remember when you drank Coca-Cola to be healthy? Do you remember when we smoked cigarettes to prolong and preserve life? 4 out of 5 doctors who gave that advice are dead now because of it. The good old days were a time when advertisers weren't held accountable for anything they ever said. I'll let you soak that one in for a moment. Accidental discharge is impossible. Most kids don't shoot themselves accidentally. They shoot their sisters or their brothers quite intentionally pulling the trigger. Now, I think that the skirting of responsibility is what the religious movement is all about, and that's why they embrace this period. They say that atheists deny the existence of God because we don't want to be accountable for our behavior, but they get to say that whatever sinning they continue to do, they'll automatically be forgiven for simply because they believe. So it occurs to me that they're the ones denying accountability. Where we hold ourselves responsible for our own actions, they don't. That's why the primary objection to global climate change isn't whether or not it's happening, but whether they have to admit any responsibility for it. Now, of course, the good old days weren't just sexist and senseless, they were overtly racist also. Nowadays, you can't just broad brush insults against whole demographics anymore. Ain't that a shame? I don't know how it is here in Canada, but back home in Texas, a lot of my neighbors complain about political correctness, as if it is somehow an infringement on their rights not to be openly disrespectful or hateful against other demographics based on race, religion, or what have you. And I've always considered prejudice to be among the worst of all human traits. I don't get how religious fundamentalists don't see bigotry as an abomination. Is it because the Bible itself is bigoted? I think that if God had written the Bible, then it should have said, as one of the commandments, thou shalt not discriminate on these bases. And I think one of the reasons that the Bible doesn't say that, and why there's no admonishment of slavery either, is because the Bible was not written by a superior being. It was written by bigots as a means of manipulating the masses, and that's why bigots endorse and enforce it. Religion and bigotry both, to me, seem to come from the same black recess in the human psyche and are so intertwined that I wonder whether it is possible to have one without the other. Now, when my wife and I toured the Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we learned that while Oral was still alive, students could be suspended for interracial dating or expelled for interracial marriage. Now, remember that back in the good old days, and even when I was still a little boy, interracial marriage was illegal in the United States. If this were 1966, I could go to jail for up to a year simply for marrying a woman who was conceived in Vietnam. She would go to jail also for being not quite white, but for marrying a white man. Half-breeds weren't considered white. They had to be purebreds, or they'd be ostracized by both sides of the family. Yeah. And the creationists say that we evolutionists are the racists, as if Hitler wasn't a Catholic Christian and a creationist who rejected evolution outright, as if Darwin didn't prefer dark-skinned natives or protest the practice of eugenics already long perpetuated by Christian groups even before his day. That's just one more thing. The religious propaganda machine got turned upside down. Here's another. Have you noticed that organizations with the word liberty in their name are all about restricting the liberties of others, especially the rights of homosexuals? They say they're in defense of the American family, but that's another thing they got backwards. Have you noticed that organizations with the word family in them tend to be devoutly religious Christians? And I think that's curious, considering what Jesus said in Matthew 10. We all know this, but you could almost sing along. Do not think that I have come to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Is it just me, or does Jesus sound like an egocentric fuck? I have to wonder, why do Christians proudly pretend to prioritize their family values? Clearly they don't have any. And ironically, they also complain about the divisiveness of tolerance. Here's another example of that end of Christian irony. Years ago, a fundamentalist group tried to amend the Colorado State Constitution in order to instill discrimination against homosexuals so that they could be denied housing or employment. And I found out about this on a film that I had to watch for my government class. And I didn't recognize the guy then because he wasn't yet famous, but the leader of this group was interviewed, and he said that as Christians, we have a right to treat certain people differently. When I heard that, I was aghast. How does this man not know that that's bigotry? Of course he did know. He just didn't care. And ironically, the man who said that was Pastor Ted Haggard. Now, for those of you who don't know, he later became famous as being the pro-family, anti-drug, anti-gay minister who was caught doing methamphetamines while cheating on his wife with a gay male prostitute. Religion reverses everything. Don't you love this? This guy tattoos a hate message against homosexuals, forgetting that, just a few passages away, he's forbidden to do that. This is the hypocrisy we constantly see. Now, Christian groups back home in Texas have actually lobbied that even violent acts of discrimination should be decriminalized if it's against homosexuals. If it's religiously motivated, they argue that it shouldn't even be considered a hate crime for the very reasons that define it as a hate crime, regardless what the excuse is. That's another thing that the religion has reversed. They say the Bible is a moral guide. The Bible says that bigotry, slavery, child abuse, rape, ritual sacrifice, and even human sacrifice are all at least occasionally acceptable, while violent pillaging, murder, and even genocide are encouraged at every opportunity. Death is the penalty for every crime, from working on weekends to being a rape victim. Yet homosexuality is an abomination, and so is crab legs and shrimp and melted butter. Why? Because the Bible says so. As if authoritarian dictates can somehow trump critical analysis. Arguments from authority are worthless, especially when the alleged authority is this damn questionable. Is it any wonder why the Bible considers scientific scrutiny to be a damnable sin? This is also why apologists try to reverse science, too. Creationists do this thing where they try to project their own faults onto others. They're not trying to say that we're as bad as they are. This isn't a matter of the pot calling the kettle black. This is a case of the pot calling the silverware black. because they're accusing us of faults they have that we will not share with them. For example, in every other avenue of life, it is dishonest to assert as fact that which is not evidently true, but that's what all religions do. If a scientist did that, he'd be guilty of fraud, and rightly so. But when religions assert their baseless speculations, unsupported by anything and contested by everything, they call that revealed truth, not fraud. And your sound, calm, reasonable, factually accurate logic will be dismissed as irrational. They accuse us of indoctrinating our children in scientific skepticism. This is one of their lies of equivocation, where they argue that evolution is a religion, that science relies on faith just like religion does, that science is biased like religion is, that there is no evidence for evolution, Big Bang, abiogenesis, etc., that there is evidence for creation, the flood, God, etc., that religion is reasonable just like science is, that religion can be confirmed empirically and experimentally just like science, and that creationism is somehow scientific. Of course, if you contest them on this, they might respond with a citation of Hebrews 11, trying to present faith as though it were evidence, the very opposite of what faith is. And if you press them on that, and they see that you know what you're talking about, they'll usually respond with an out-of-context quotation of Romans 1:22, professing to be wise, they became fools. And this is usually followed by Psalm 14:1, the fool saith in his heart, there is no God. Now this one's not out of context. It's just wrong. If you compare any collection of dictionaries to get a consensus definition, you'll find that a fool is a victim of deception, because he too readily believes improbable claims by incredulous people on insufficient evidence. The Bible defines a fool as the exact opposite of what a fool really is, because it is never wise to believe something said by another without question, without reservation, or without reason. Yet that religious faith requires all of that. And if you're foolish enough to meet that criteria, then which is worse, the fool or the fool who follows him? And it's worse, well, this is why you want to question authority. But it's worse because of the next lines of Psalms 14. Regarding atheists, it says, they are corrupt, they do abominable things. There is none that does good. None? The beauty of a totalitarian statement like this, of an ultimatum like this, is, or an absolute, is that it only takes one exception to prove it wrong. And there are many atheists who are not corrupt and who don't do abominable things. But even those who do, occasionally do good things too. And there are an awful lot of atheists who've done a whole lot of good. So the Bible's simply wrong about that too, like it's wrong about everything else. But it's not like logic or evidence is ever going to change a lot of these people's minds. Remember, you're talking about people who wear the psychological armor of God, meaning that they have closed their minds to logic to render themselves impervious to being reasoned with. Their beliefs are not based on logic, and that's why they don't use logical arguments to convince believers. The typical practice is to tell them to believe what you're told or else. And now I'm going to get medieval on your ass. How often do you get to say that? This is my son, standing next to one of several type cages meant to prolong a withering death, often by stripping the victim naked and leaving him subjected to the elements, occasionally with unforgiving observers lobbing stones and jabbing with sticks. Now, how do you get a whole community to act in unison with such barbarity, such that no one raises their hands in objection to try to reason with that mob? And this is what always happens when religion has rule over law. When the mandates of madness enforce conformity, this is what you get. Now, Voltaire, a philosopher for the Enlightenment, famously said, "Those who believe absurdities will commit atrocities." And Nobel physicist Steven Weinberg also noted that religion is an insult to humanity. With or without it, you have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But to have good people do evil things, that requires religion. And it doesn't seem to matter which religion it is, because they're all seemingly insane. So forget all about the horror stories that you've heard about the Islamic terrorists in other parts of the world. Christian history was just as bad once upon a time. If you were convicted of heresy or blasphemy or adultery, there were all kinds of cruel devices designed to burn, bend, break, flail, or maim you with the greatest potential pain over the longest possible period of time, with no chance of recovery or rehabilitation, simply to impart insufferable anguish pointlessly, the epitome of evil. After the Middle Ages, history books talk about French Catholics murdering Protestant Huguenots by the hundreds. And after that, we have Anglican or English Protestants killing masses of Catholics. And then we have the Puritans torturing Quakers in the street. And we haven't even mentioned the witches yet, or other pagans either. I tell you sincerely that when I was a little boy, the thing that scared me most in movies wasn't vampires or werewolves. It was Puritans. There was a movie where someone was accused of being a witch. The reason was absurd. It couldn't have been avoided because it couldn't have been predicted because it didn't make any sense. And it's impossible to reason with superstitious people. So at any time, for any reason, no matter how careful you are, the entire community can suddenly turn against you, rally up, and hunt you down. And forget pod people or zombies. An unreasonable mob in a witch hunt is much scarier than that. Especially when you're in a wilderness situation you have absolutely no one to turn to. And let's not forget that the Puritans came to this country to escape religious persecution. And they brought it with them. And they visited on their neighbors. Now, I've always considered myself a patriot. But I think it's important not to fool yourself for love of country. The 4th of July is our Independence Day. That's the day we celebrate our national pride. And one year, I spent the early part of that day watching 8 successive documentaries on public television, each 1-hour episode depicting atrocities imposed by American government agencies against its own citizenry. How we inhibited women and prohibited them from voting. What we did to blacks during the period between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. How we imprisoned Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. What we did to oppress Irish and Chinese immigrants and Latin American farm workers. How Missouri issued an extermination order against the Mormons. And the long, horrible string of terrors that we had visited on the Native American tribes just since the United States was founded. Really disturbing, inhumane, unconstitutional stuff. And this didn't cause me to love my country any less, but it gave me a realistic perspective, and it illustrated the importance of activism. Before you assure yourself what your country would never do, find out what it has already done. And pay close attention to what it's trying to do next. Since 2010, a few representatives of the American Tea Party, that's a right-wing religious fundamentalist offshoot of the Republican Party, have introduced several pieces of legislation to effect key changes to what appear to be one ultimate goal. They fought against national health care, and they have tried to eliminate all other social welfare programs that would provide medicine, food, housing, and other assistance to women and infant children. They're trying to criminalize abortion and eliminate Planned Parenthood and all other options for birth control. Remember that they're against sex education too. So what they want is for poor, stupid teenagers to crank out babies they can neither prevent nor provide for. They'd be denied food stamps, Medicaid, Medicare, and any other support like that because the Tea Party wants to defund all those things. But it gets even worse than that. The Tea Party, it's not enough that you dumb down the lessons that students already get in school. The Tea Party wants to eliminate free, compulsory education altogether, simply because it is secular and funded by taxes. They want schooling to be exclusively religious, teaching fantasy as fact. And according to one bill that was suggested, they also want classrooms to be racially segregated again. Not kidding. And they want all available schools to be profitable, private businesses with no national standard and reserved only for the kids who can afford it. So, what happens to the kids who are now deprived of free education, who no longer compulsory education, they're wandering the streets? And they can't afford to attend classes with the rich white kids. Well, the Tea Party has also argued that child labor laws are unconstitutional. They also want to repeal the minimum wage, eliminating the middle class, and quickly dividing the population between the haves and the have-nots. And mind you, they're also against government regulations, and they want to abolish the Environmental Protection Agency, permitting unrestricted pollution with no penalties other than those which would be quickly imposed by nature herself. In their ideal world, rich kids would be deceived into believing mysticism. Their factories or their estates would be maintained by what would be effectively slaves. Their factories would be operated by illiterate, underage children with no education, nowhere to go, and no future worth living for. These right-wing religious ideologues want to drag us all the way back to the good old days of the Industrial Revolution, a period of unprecedented pollution and child labor which ended shortly before this image was taken. For those affected, it was one of the worst, lowest standards of living in American history. But it gets even worse than that. Because the religious right want to censor or control information on the internet and everywhere else. So imagine all this happening in the wasteland of a third world theocracy. Because that's what America would become with no middle class, and thus no American dream. Now, growing up, I was always told that the reason devil worshippers use an upside-down cross as their symbol is because the forces of evil like to spin things into the opposite of whatever they really are. And I believe that to some degree that statement is true, and I'm not just talking about Fox News. There are several Christian organizations who are formally recognized as hate groups. And I know many Christians who always seem to be depressed, paranoid, easily offended all the time. And the only time they seem to be happy, the only time they light up, is when they talk about how the world is going to end. And these same people tell me that only Christians can experience joy. The further we look into the darkness and the ignorance whence we came, the more superstitious and the less sane, sensitive, or sensible we were. The more religious any community is, the worse its corrupt condition will be. To give you an idea how distorted all this is, there is a custom of systematically rationalizing excuses, shamelessly attempting to justify this injustice, and this offensive practice is ironically known as apologetics. In their upside-down, backwards, head-up-your-ass mindset, fantasy becomes reality, and freedom is oppressive, hypocrisy is noble, and slavery is moral, because lies become truth when wisdom is foolish and reason is irrational, because faith is evidence, tolerance is divisive, love is conditional, and inexcusable acts of absolute evil are defended and promoted as good and godly righteousness. That is how religion poisons, perverts, inverts, and reverses everything. Okay, there are only one or two questions I can take. I didn't look like there was going to be anybody. What are you going to do, ask me about my family? Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you very much for that message. In the last little while, we've heard endless from and about the NRA. One of the arguments that we hear coming out of the woodwork is we're going to need those guns because there may be an armed revolution coming. Not long after that, there was a news story that the American government was buying up whackloads of ammunition. So much so that the NRA said, you know what, they're buying up all the ammunition. What do you think about this possibility of an armed revolution?
I don't think of it as a possibility, at least not where the government is taking all our arms to disarm us. I don't think that that's happening. I don't see that there's a point or probability that we will lead to a revolution yet. On the issue of gun control, I could just mention that for a moment. I've argued a few times in defense of ownership of guns, and it's brought me a lot of controversy in the atheist movement because most people are against gun ownership. I have no problem with strict gun control laws. I just don't want laws that tell me what I can and can't own. And what I see as an issue with gun ownership is that we don't, and we really need to do this not just for gun ownership, but for many other things too. There need to be a change in how we diagnose and treat mental illness in my country. And that if we were able to test for psychological disorders, then maybe Alex Jones wouldn't have 50 guns in his house.
Yeah, I just wondered if, I think I've got the state right. I read recently where, I think it was North Carolina, several of the legislatures proposed exempting that state from certain aspects of the U.S. Constitution. I wondered if you'd like to comment on that. And secondly, are you familiar with the Dominionist or Reconstructionists, and is their influence increasing or decreasing?
Sadly, to the second part of your question, that's the reason that I'm an activist now. Is because I encountered Dominionists and they outlined their plan. This was before the wedge document became publicized. These other people were bragging about what they had already done, about how they had already positioned certain senators, judges, and whatnot, according to their church lobbies violating their tax exemption status by voting as a bloc. And that's much what our Board of Education did also. And as far as the North Carolina issue, I don't really have a comment on that. I understood that the federal government has several places, or at least a few, where it says that the laws set out by the federal government will apply to the states regardless what the states want to say in protest.